let's talk about all of this even further with our friends there at Axios Politics, Aaron Doherty, and legal analyst Neama Rahmani. They join me. You guys, thanks for being with us here. I know it's always kind of chaotic to keep up with so many of these minutia of the Trump legal cases, but it is important. And so I want to put this up here from Erica Orden. This is what I was saying. She says Merchan has expanded his gag order to include his own family members and those of the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. Now, Neama, my first question to you, the gag order expansion, so to speak, if Trump was any other defendant, not a former president, running to be president again, would a judge kind of issue more punitive action against some of these comments that he made, especially on Truth Social, going after Juan Merchan's daughter? He's just expanding the gag order. But he violated the gag order, so to speak, in a way, right?
Oh, no question. Anyone else would have been held in contempt and probably be in custody by now. But obviously, the former president is no ordinary defendant, and judges have been hesitant to actually hold to the fire. We know that Judge Engoron fined him, but we're talking about nominal amounts, $5,000 and $10,000. That's not a whole lot of money in the big scheme of things. So my general thoughts are these gag orders aren't worth the electronic paper they're written on if the judges won't actually enforce them.
You know, and Aaron, I want to ask you too as well. We know that this is Trump being Trump. I mean, he posts about all of his cases all the time on Truth Social as well, seemingly, you know, unvarnished, unadulterated. This is what he thinks. Even on one of the posts recently, he went after the bond that he had to post, $91 million, after the E. Jean Carroll defamation verdict as well. So for voters out there on the campaign trail, does this matter to them? Do they mind this at all? Or do they already know it's kind of baked in the cake? This is just Trump being Trump.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, former President Trump's legal troubles have become kind of inextricably linked to his 2024 presidential campaign. And we saw during the Republican primary that former President Trump was sort of balancing the Republican primary from a courtroom. And obviously that did not have any impact on his standing in Republican voters. He kind of cruised to victory in the Republican primary. Of course, questions remain over how his legal issues will play with a sort of more diverse, broader audience in a general election in November. And he obviously has to win over some voters who may not be willing to put up with his legal troubles if he does want to win in what is likely going to be a very close November election with President Biden. But at this point, former President Trump's legal troubles are kind of an inherent part of his presidential campaign. And voters, I do think, are aware of that, given how baked in it is to his rhetoric.
You know, Neama, also, we got this news in, I think this was just hours ago, attorneys for Trump filing a letter requesting to file a motion asking that Judge Juan Merchan, the trial judge in the Stormy Daniels hush money payment case, to recuse himself from the case, citing his daughter and her ties to Democrats. Now, that's why Merchan wants to expand the gag order in question in the first place, because Trump went after his daughter on Truth Social as well. Now Trump's attorneys want Merchan recused from the case writ large and toto because of this. How likely do you think they'll be successful in that effort?
Andrew, there's no chance. You know, family members of judges can do all sorts of things. They can be active politically. Look no further than Justice Clarence Thomas of the Supreme Court and his wife, Ginny. She's obviously very active. So as long as the judge himself or herself stays in their lane, they don't take sides, what family members do, what someone's child does is not grounds to get a judge disqualified. So I know Trump and his lawyers, they're very litigious. Some of this is tactical. This litigation ends up slowing these cases procedurally, but there's no chance that this motion will have any chance of a success either at the trial or the appellate level.
You know, Aaron, I wanted to ask you, too, because when you get back to the massive, massive bond payments underwriters had to put up for the former president, $90 million in the E. Jean Carroll suit, $175 million after the civil fraud judgment. Trump, I thought, made an interesting quip in one of his Truth Social posts, saying this is money that he cannot use to help his presidential campaign. Now, from what I understand, and I know many people who follow and cover his campaigns stemming back from 2016, Trump was never really a self-funder of his own presidential campaigns, was he? So I thought that line was really interesting. How does he fund his campaigns? Is it small dollar donors and mega dollar donors? That's it?
Yeah, so that Truth Social post, there's been no indication that he has put any of his own money into his 2024 presidential campaign, and the same goes for his 2020 election and presidential campaign from 2020. Former President Trump's presidential campaign is really driven by kind of wealthy Republican donors. He also does have a strong grassroots base, but something that is really important with Trump's fundraising as we look ahead to November is that former President Trump and the Republican National Committee are really facing a cash deficit when compared to President Biden and the Democratic National Committee. And as former President Trump fights these kind of numerous legal battles that he has to go through, he also does, of course, have to run a presidential campaign. And he's bleeding through cash to support these fees. And the Republican National Committee ended 2023 with some of its lowest cash on hand totals in almost a decade. And so I think kind of the story going forward with former President Trump's financials is sort of how can he make up ground to compete with this sort of very financially robust and secure President Biden and DNC.
You know, Neama, it's kind of a full circle moment because the Stormy Daniels hush money case, part of that is about campaign finance and kind of in-kind donations to a presidential campaign. You know, that's what Alvin Bragg is alleging that was made here via these payments to Stormy Daniels to get her to be quiet about this affair that she had with Trump back in the early aughts. But any of these bond amounts, I mean, you know, they can't be used for a presidential campaign or at least to fund it. I mean, that's just a no-no. We shouldn't even be talking about that. And they're not going to, right?
Oh, no, that's part of election law. You cannot use these funds for campaign purposes, and campaign purposes are just that, you know, although you can pay for certain legal fees that are related to the campaign. So that's something that's not going to happen. But like you said, it is really full circle here. And we know why Alvin Bragg is saying that the Stormy Daniels hush money payment is a campaign finance violation, because that's how you get those charges from a misdemeanor, which would really be a slap on the wrist, to a felony under New York law. So a little bit of a convoluted argument. Some may say it's a stretch, but I think Donald Trump and his campaign finance committee know better than to use any campaign contributions for these other purposes.
You guys, just last question too, because we have the trial date set as April 15th in the Stormy Daniels hush money payment case. You know, obviously, I'm loath to talk about these things as fixed in time because it always seems like there are delay pressures put on them and then they get moved down the calendar. But it seems like the first one is finally going to be happening because we've talked about these Trump trials kind of theoretically and hypothetically for what, like the last 2 years, and you really just couldn't, you know, wrap your head around the fact it was somewhat surreal that a former president will be tried in 4 different jurisdictions. He could be a convicted felon, you know, come November, if not, you know, into January. But Neama, have you thought about the distinct possibility that if former President Donald Trump wins the 2024 election, that he is president-elect, but also in the middle of some of these criminal trials? I mean, that is extremely unprecedented. I don't think people have wrapped their head around that very distinct possibility.
Oh, it's a very real possibility because I don't think we're anywhere near trial in the 2 election fraud cases or in the classified documents case. But it's pretty well established that if Trump is elected in November and he's president-elect, that his criminal problems will go away. The Department of Justice has a long-standing policy that a sitting president can't be prosecuted. I don't think it would make much sense for prosecutors, whether it's Jack Smith or anyone else, to continue moving forward with these cases. And by the way, that same logic that applies on the federal level will probably also apply stateside. So I think Fani Willis's case would also go away if Trump is indeed reelected.
And Aaron, just lastly with you too, when it comes to how voters respond to all of this, you know, have they reckoned, is there any polling to suggest that, you know, they will either stick by him or flee from him if he is convicted in any of these? And if voters even think they're going to happen by November the 5th?
Right. So polling out of the kind of early primary states in the Republican primary, exit polling found that there are a kind of sizable chunk of Republican voters, not a majority, nowhere close to a majority, who do express kind of skepticism and concern over former President Trump being elected if he is convicted. There are some Republican voters who aren't able to commit at this point to voting for former President Trump if he is in fact convicted of a crime. And so again, it remains to be seen how these voters actually do turn out in November, because that's obviously the biggest indication of how voters feel. But I do think that if former President Trump is convicted before November, it certainly will raise doubts among some Republican voters.
Yeah, you know, I keep saying lastly here, I just thought of this too. We have a live now look there at the White House because House Republicans today, they released and introduced a bill to rename Dulles International Airport in the D.C. area after Donald Trump. So live now look there in the D.C. area, of course, at the White House. Jerry Connolly, a Democratic congressman from Virginia, you guys, he issued this short, brief statement in response. Donald Trump is facing 91 felony charges. If Republicans want to name something after him, I'd suggest they find a federal prison. So I thought that was somewhat of a neat bow on this conversation here, that this is going to be talked about throughout the duration of this year. Neama, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us. Talk soon.
Thank you.